All right, well, thanks you all for coming today. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Alan Dershowitz. At the age of 28, he was the youngest person ever to become a full professor at Harvard, where he is currently the Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law. He has published dozens of books on legal and political issues, and among them are, shall I show the recent ones? These are since the book that he's going to talk about today. These are since that one. So, Is There a Right to Remain Silent? And The Case Against Israel's Enemies. And then I was going to mention a couple of others. Blasphemy, How the Religious Right is Hijacking the Declaration of Independence. The Case for Peace, How the Arab-Israeli Conflict Can Be Resolved. Taking Liberties, A Decade of Hard Cases, Bad Laws, and Bum Raps. That's just a few of the several dozen. Professor Dershowitz is also well known for his legal career and is noted for representing some rather high-profile individuals, including Patty Hearst, whom I remember. I remember the day she was kidnapped, Klaus von Bülow, and O.J. Simpson. That's just a few of the notorious ones. He has written extensively on First Amendment freedoms, and we are fortunate today to have him join us here, as have several of his former students, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, Jeffrey Toobin, before him. So he's here to discuss one of his recent books, Finding Jefferson, A Lost Letter, A Remarkable Discovery, and the First Amendment in an Age of Terrorism.
Thank you so much, Anne. Thank you, Anne, and thank you all, both here and in distant locations, for coming and listening to me. I'm going to tell you a fascinating adventure story about something I found which has real historical significance. But in order to understand why it's such a fascinating story, especially for those of you who believe in some sense of destiny, I have to tell you just a few things about some of my own passions and my own background. I have been a collector since the time I was 3 years old. I've collected bottle tops and baseball cards and comic books and autographed baseballs, and you name it, I collect it. Scrimshaw, everything in the world. In fact, my wife has a new rule for our house. For everything I bring in, I have to put out something of equal size. Otherwise, we'll have to move out ourselves. So I've been lately into getting small stuff so I can try to keep my large collections intact. So the first thing you have to know about me is I'm a passionate collector, and among the things I collect are Americana, things that deal with American constitutional law, American constitutional history. Second, I don't have very many heroes, but Thomas Jefferson is one of them. Not as a human being, not his lifestyle, not all the things he did, but his political philosophy. And as Anne mentioned, one of the books I wrote was about the Declaration of Independence and what Jefferson meant by nature's God, inalienable rights, all men are created equal. So I have a passion for Jefferson. And finally, my academic passion, which I got my tenure for back in 67 or so, and what I've been writing about for 40-something years has been how to balance the need to prevent violence, terrorism, crime, against civil liberties, particularly free speech. When does free speech become incitement? When can we prohibit free speech? Should we always keep the marketplace completely open? All right, so imagine somebody with that background walking downtown in New York, midtown in New York, and it was a nice day. I just had a frustrating lunch with somebody, and I decided to get rid of my frustrations by walking into my favorite bookstore, Argosy, which is in Manhattan, and they have, not only in Argosy do they have books, but they also have photographs and autographs. And so I walked in and I asked the woman, do you have any autographs that I might be interested in? Do you have anything from the old Brooklyn Dodgers? I collect that. And she said, yeah, I have Carl Furillo. I know I have that one already. She said, well, just this week, somebody brought in a letter that they had had in the family for a long time, which has a very nice autograph of Thomas Jefferson. I don't have an autograph of Thomas Jefferson. I'd like to see that. So she shows me the autograph of Thomas Jefferson. It was a nice autograph, but it came on a letter. And I said, what's the letter about? She said, I don't know. Maybe you can explain it. And I opened up this letter. You want to just show the letter? It's just one page, kind of browning letter that looks like it's kind of falling apart a little bit. And it's a beautiful letter written in hand by Thomas Jefferson, and in fact it has 3 autographs, He writes it in the third person. Thomas Jefferson responds, and then he signs it Thomas Jefferson. And of course, to save 10 cents or whatever it was, he franked it too. He was President of the United States, so he signed it on the envelope as well. And it was written on the eve of the 25th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, the evening of July 3rd, 1801. Jefferson had just moved into the White House, the new executive mansion. He had just won the dirtiest political campaign in American history. I tell you, that campaign between Adams and Jefferson makes the current campaign seem like a Tea Party. They were calling each other the foulest of names imaginable. Adams said that if you elect Jefferson, he and Thomas Paine will deflower all your daughters in the name of atheism. And, you know, it's Adams and God and Jefferson and atheism. In any event, Jefferson not only had to beat Adams, but he also had to beat his running mate. You can imagine Sarah Palin having decided she's going to now take the presidency away from McCain if he wins the election, or Biden. What happened is the man who was running for vice president decided he had the same number of votes as Jefferson. And so Aaron Burr ran against Jefferson, and it took 50 some odd ballots. And finally, Jefferson was declared the president. So he's sitting there, it's July 4th, and he writes a letter to somebody who wrote to him saying, you know, there's this minister. He's out there, and he made, very, very prominent minister named Griswold in New Milford, Connecticut. And he made this very interesting sermon. In those days, sermons got published and circulated. They were like pamphlets. And in the sermon, he said, you know, if a minister makes a speech, a sermon, and he incites any of his followers, any of his congregants, to do something criminal or immoral or violent, the minister ought to be held responsible for his conduct. That a speech can itself be an overt act and can actually be treason. So this guy writes to Jefferson and says, what do you think, Mr. President? In those days, you know, presidents just responded to letters like that. And this is Jefferson's response. And he writes back and he gives 5 reasons why he thinks that a minister should not be held responsible, why free speech essentially should prevail over safety and security. I read this letter, I say to myself, first of all, somebody's planted this. I mean, somebody knew I was coming into the store, knew it was me, or else Thomas Jefferson is writing a letter to me. I mean, who could he have been writing to? This is what I've been writing about, thinking about, and arguing about for my entire legal career. And he sets out all these arguments, and they're arguments that are fascinating, and I don't agree with them all. They're interesting arguments. And so I'd say, I have to have this letter. Now, I think of myself as a pretty shrewd bargainer, but this woman knew she had me. And I'm amazed she didn't raise the price, but I finally, you know, gave her the asking price. I took the letter home with me. I couldn't believe it. I took it home with me on a Friday. By Monday, I had written 10,000 words toward a book that I knew I had to write about this. And it basically took the form of a letter from me to Thomas Jefferson because I thought he had written to me. And so I wrote back. I still haven't gotten a reply, but, you know, the mails are slow these days. But in the letter, I take him on. And I, first of all, bring him up to date. And I explained to him what's happened to freedom of speech in the 200 and some odd years since he wrote. And then I answer all of his points and try to respond to them. Before I get to those arguments very briefly, the letter itself is fascinating in terms of its provenance. It was written to a guy in Connecticut, and it stayed in the family for all those years, from 1801 until the week before I bought it, when, for reasons unknown, it was sold to this store in New York. But for all those years, it remained in the family, and only one person either saw it or learned about it, a historian named Charles Beard, who was the next-door neighbor, was told about its contents and used a sentence from it in a July 4th oration, which led the Supreme Court to quote it, but Beard got it wrong. He got the grammar a little wrong, and so it ended up being misquoted a little bit in the Supreme Court decision. So I then had this letter, and it was just remarkable, and I had to write a book. I actually wanted to entitle the book, the publishers took the wimpy way out, and they called the book Finding Jefferson. I wanted to name it Finding, Framing, and Hanging Jefferson, with a picture of the letter in the frame and then hanging on the wall, but they thought that was a little too provocative. And so The letter itself gives these arguments, and I just really wanted to focus on one of the arguments that is very, very relevant to today. I'll just very briefly mention what the other arguments are. The first argument was an expressed opinion can never be an overt act. That's a very interesting normative position, that an expression of an opinion can never be an overt act. Think about that for a second. What if somebody expressed the opinion that so-and-so should be killed, and the person expressing the opinion was Tony Soprano, and he was talking to one of his hitmen? I imagine that the expression of such an opinion could be an overt act. Or which King Henry was it who said, "Who will rid me of this priest?" And obviously resulted in the death of Thomas à Becket. So you can have an expression of opinion that can probably be an overt act. But then his second argument is, if the conscience is the umpire, which is what the minister said, then each judge's conscience will govern, and if every judge's conscience is different, then obviously there'll be no consistency, and it'll be very hard to have freedom of speech. The third argument, which is the one I really want to focus on, is, quote, "We have nothing to fear from the demoralizing reasoning of some if others are left free to demonstrate their errors." That's the classic marketplace of ideas argument, made first probably by Milton, made by others throughout history. As long as the marketplace of ideas is open, there should be no censorship or suppression, an argument I surely agree with. And then his fourth argument is the law stands ready to punish the first criminal act produced by the false reasoning. In other words, we can wait. We might as well wait until the crime is committed and then arrest the criminal rather than arrest the speaker. And finally, these are safer correctives than the conscience of a judge. So what I want to do is just spend a few minutes talking about transposing Thomas Jefferson's views to modern days, to the age of terrorism in which we now live. By the way, for those of you who don't believe that Thomas Jefferson knew about terrorism, remember he was the first president to confront Islamic terrorism. He, after all, sent the Marines to fight the Barbary pirates. Who were the Barbary pirates? The Barbary pirates were Islamic terrorists. We all know the song, "From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli." The shores of Tripoli reflect the Barbary pirates. What happened is, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not on July 5th, 1776, but shortly thereafter, when the United States separated from Great Britain called the Barbary Coast pirates and said, American shipping is no longer protected by British naval forces. They're free game. Yeah. And the Barbary pirates started to attack American shipping with the implicit acceptance of the Brits. And they did it pretty barbarically. They beheaded American sailors. They enslaved American women. They raped young girls, took American children and made them into slaves. And Jefferson and Adams were sent to meet with the ambassador from the Barbary Coast, which is today basically Tripoli. And this is the way Jefferson reported his meeting back to John Jay, who was the Secretary of State. Jefferson said, you can't be doing this. And the ambassador answered that the right was founded on the laws of the prophet. It was written in their Quran that all nations should not have answered their authority with sinners, that it was their right and duty to make war upon them whenever they could be found, and to make slaves of all who they could take as prisoners, and that every Muslim who should be slain in battle was sure to go to paradise. Doesn't that sound a little bit familiar from some of the things we've heard today, other than the 72 virgins? By the way, I've always thought if we could persuade some of the extremist imams that they're misreading the text, you don't get 72 virgins for killing innocent people, all you get is one 72-year-old virgin. Maybe we could have an impact on slowing down some of the terrorism. But in those days, in any event, this was the approach which some extremists cited their Quran, miscited the Quran as far as I'm concerned for. And this is what Thomas Jefferson had to deal with. So he understood the power of incitement. He understood the power of speech. And yet he made the argument in the marketplace of ideas. Now, where do I disagree with him? I disagree with him when he says we have nothing to fear. We have nothing to fear from the demoralizing reasoning of some if others are left free to demonstrate their errors. We have plenty to fear. Free speech is not free. Free speech is very costly. The First Amendment is an experiment. Speech hurts. Speech can kill. Speech can maim, speech can psychologically damage. We pay a very heavy price. And it's despite the fact that speech can be very dangerous and very damaging that I want to protect it. I don't want to protect it because I think there's no argument on the other side. I'm a civil libertarian, but I'm not the kind of civil libertarian who says, let's abolish torture. I want to abolish torture too. Let's abolish torture, some people say, because it never works. I wish that were the case. Tragically, it sometimes works. When the Nazis tortured the French resistance members during the Second World War, many of the best people in the world turned in their brothers, their fathers, their sisters, their parents, their loved ones. Torture sometimes works. Nonetheless, we should abolish torture. Free speech sometimes hurts. Nonetheless, we should protect free speech. So I think Jefferson took the easy way out. On balance, he was right, but I think for some of the wrong reasons. I think his final argument is correct. These are safer correctives than the conscience of a judge. For me, the strongest argument in favor of free speech is always its opposite. What if you don't have free speech? If you don't have free speech, then you have a regime of censorship. If you have a regime of censorship, who decides what to censor? How do you limit censorship? Only to the most extreme cases. We're going to see a movement today toward more and more censorship, and it's all your fault. It's all your fault. It's all the fault of modern high technology. What's the reason for that? The strongest claims for censorship and prior restrictions on free speech today is the anonymous internet. It used to be that you could hold people responsible for what they said. We always knew who said things. The reason that the Pentagon Papers was allowed to go forward and publish is the Supreme Court said, we have the home address of the Washington Post and the New York Times, and if you end up revealing any classified information that hurts the country, we can go after you. You can't go after anonymous internet people who use Melbourne, Australia as their source and put despicable lies on the internet or dangerous information or instructions how to make a nuclear bomb or instructions how to wage a terrorist attack. So there is a movement today, a new movement toward restrictions on free speech. I would urge us to resist that movement and to understand that, again, free speech is going to be very expensive and very costly, but we should not, I believe under any circumstances, restrict it. It's interesting because in the war we're fighting against terrorism today, many of our rights have been constrained. Clearly Guantanamo, clearly Abu Ghraib, clearly what's going on in many, many parts of the world, and particularly in many parts of this country, restrict many of the provisions of the Bill of Rights, habeas corpus, trial by jury, right to counsel. There is one right that hasn't yet been restricted, and that is the right of full and free political expression. There has been no real attempt in this country to censor free speech. There has been in England, there has been in France, there has been in Holland, but not yet in this country. Part of the reason is very obvious. Most of the rights that have been taken away are not owned by wealthy people. The right of habeas corpus, who has to benefit from habeas corpus? The poorest among us. Free speech is the right largely of the wealthy. Who benefits most from free speech? The media, the corporate owners of the media, and therefore they are on the side of that right. That's one right that is very popular among people in power. And I think most people in power, most of the media realize if you start restricting free speech at the edges, it can really have an impact at the core as well. And so free speech is the one right that has not yet been compromised. One of the reasons I'm tough on terrorism, and I would like to see us do more to prevent terrorism, is I think terrorism poses the greatest threat to civil liberties in the world today. I think if we ever had another terrorist attack, and I was very worried, particularly during this past week, imagine what impact a terrorist attack would have had on the sinking markets around the world. You know, fortunately, we have been able, at least, if not to prevent, to not allow terrorists to pick their times and targets. The first casualty of terrorism, if there were another massive attack on the United States, might well be civil liberties. And that's why, as a civil libertarian, I think it's so important to be tough on terrorism, to prevent acts of terrorism. But my major message to Jefferson and my major message to you is that life is a balance. There are no free lunches. There are no easy solutions. Every right comes with a cost. Every single right carries with it the potential of having your safety diminished somewhat. And I want to hear your opinions on this, and I want to have a conversation with you in the true Jeffersonian tradition. So what I'm going to do is end my remarks with a brief story, my favorite story, from the Talmud, which is the kind of commentary on the Old Testament done by rabbis just about at the time of Jesus, in the beginning of this past millennium. And the story is about a teacher called Rabbi Eliezer, who was conducting a class on property. And the issue was who owns a valuable bird found outside of someone's home. And Rabbi Eliezer said the rule is very simple. If the bird is found more than 40 feet outside of the house, it belongs to the person who found it. Logical. If it's found within 40 feet of the house, it belongs to the person in front of whose house it was found. The student Jeremiah raises his hand and says, but Rabbi, what if 1 foot of the bird is outside of 40 yards and 1 foot of the bird is inside of 40 yards? And the Talmud said for asking that kind of a question, the student was thrown out of the yeshiva, the house of learning. I loved that story because I went to a yeshiva, a Jewish parochial school, and I would always ask those kinds of questions. And my rabbis would always throw me out, saying those are klutz questions. Those are the questions that only somebody who didn't respect the rule would ask. And I'm just starting my 45th year of teaching at Harvard, and it's become so clear to me that every good question has 1 foot of the bird on one side of the line and 1 foot of the bird on the other side of the line. 1 foot may be bigger than the other. It may be weightier. It may be something you should give more credit to. But there is no problem worth discussing. Whether it be a woman's right to choose abortion, separation of church and state, freedom of speech, habeas corpus, the exclusionary rule, pornography, you name it, there's going to be 1 foot of the bird on one side of the line and 1 foot of the bird on the other. And that was Jefferson's major failing in this letter. He didn't see both sides of the issue. I sympathized with Harry Truman when he was president. And he said, I want you to get me a lawyer who's been in an accident and has had his arm amputated. And then the person asked him, why do you want a lawyer whose arm's been amputated? He said, I'm sick and tired of these lawyers who come in and tell me on the one hand, on the other hand, I want a one-handed lawyer. Well, you can't get a good lawyer who's one-handed. You can't get a good moralist who's one-handed. You can't get a good thinker who's one-handed. Every problem has an on the one hand and on the other hand. So, with a promise from me that none of you will be thrown out of this house of learning, regardless of your questions, I would like your questions on any subject related to freedom of speech, civil liberties, civil rights. Jefferson, let's have a conversation.
Hi. So I just had a crazy idea, and I just wanted to share that.
Good.
Inspired by your stories. So I'm going to make a crazy claim that, from a physiological point of view, if you kind of dig down deep into the relationships among having an idea, expressing or articulating that idea in speech, and carrying out some idea through some action, killing someone or something physical beyond speech, that ultimately it's a continuum.
Clearly.
So is it really just a gross approximation to protect something like speech, but to have very clear and often harsh laws for actions?
Okay.
It really isn't just a continuous space.
Well, and there's more to the continuum than that. When Jesus spoke on the Mount and said, I come not to destroy the law but to fulfill it, he expanded the rules of the Old Testament, which said, thou shalt not murder. And he said, anyone who thinks about murdering, anybody who thinks about adultery, it's already as if they've committed adultery. So he extended the continuum as a religious figure from merely thinking about something to the ultimate act. And of course it's a continuum, but the job of law, as distinguished from perhaps natural sciences, is to break continua, to draw lines, to say on the continuum we will draw the line at the point of thinking about it? No, that seems too early. Talking about it? Well, depending on what you say. Inciting it? Maybe that's the appropriate point. Conspiring with another to do it? Maybe that's too late. Doing it itself, Jefferson says, that's where we should wait. So the job of the lawyer and the job of the moralist is not to describe, the scientist describes. You're absolutely right. As a scientist, you've described an appropriate continuum. You could take the continuum back further, genetically. Predispositions, early birth experiences. My former colleagues at Harvard, the Glucks, tried to predict delinquency from the age of 3 years by looking at under-the-house environments and that kind of thing. And others looked at the XYY chromosome to try to predict. Now we know that there is genetic testing that can predict with some degrees, not always accurate, over predictions, and that can hit sometimes very close to home. So there are continua that science gives us, and indeed life's a continua in so many different ways. And the scientists can tell us what's on the continua, but other social scientists can tell us what other continua to look for that might cross-connect in different ways. And then we have to decide, democratically as a society, lawyers, where to draw the line, at what point to intervene. None of us would want thought police that intruded. Now with MRI imaging, we can get to people very, very early. We can find out whether people are lying. We can find out whether or not a statement comes from deep in the memory or is constructed and made up. Science is going to really help us identify and move the continuum back. Even 35 years ago, I wrote about a machine when you walk through the door, it doesn't search you for weapons, it searches you for ideas. And before you get on the airplane, it can figure out whether you had any ideas that were inconsistent with airplane safety and security. No matter what science does, we're going to have to decide where the appropriate continua are. Science will help us. It will inform us. I agree with G.E. Moore that there is a naturalistic fallacy that to infer normative conclusions from descriptive facts is a mistake, but to ignore scientific facts in drawing normative conclusions is also a mistake. You have to look to science, but you have to look at it through the lens of morality and philosophy. So I completely agree with your description of a continuum, and then the democratic response is, where do we draw the line?
A quick follow-up. So
Sure.
is law then effectively always an engineering effort as opposed to science?
It's a very good point. I have engineers who think they're doing science, but it's, yeah. I mean, law must understand science, but law creates mechanisms for allowing democracy to make hard decisions about science. Scientists develop the nuclear bomb. The lawyers decide when it's appropriate, when it's legal to use it in self-defense and preemptive self-defense, all of these issues, yeah. And the nuclear bomb is simply a metaphor for every other weapon that can both have good and bad uses, which is most weapons.
Thank you, Professor.
Sure.
You've argued that we haven't restricted free speech in America. Would you say the right to freedom of speech is intimately tied to the right to peaceful assembly, and that with restrictions on the right to assemble, i.e. the Republican National Convention and other things, that we are in effect restricting the right to free speech?
I think it's a very good point, and it picks up on the continuum point. Obviously, there is a continuum between thinking about something, simply articulating it to yourself, articulating it to a small group of people, getting on television, adding the physical dimension of many people together, putting it on a stick with a sign. These are all part of a continuum, and I take your point. I think that restrictions on assembly, which have existed, and have existed for many, many years, they're not so new. The first restrictions on assembly, obviously, was on union assembly, because it was always thought that Justice Black used to call it speech on a stick. I called it a speech sickle. If you're part of a picket line, the potential of threats from the picket line grows, and therefore Justice Black, who was one of the great advocates of free speech, had different rules for speech that was part of assembly in a picket line than speech that was purely verbal. Jefferson, of course, lived at a time, people don't know this about Jefferson. You know, Jefferson never made a campaign speech, and he almost never delivered his own speeches. He was a terrible speaker, unlike Abraham Lincoln, who was a great, great speaker, and Adams, who was a great speaker. Jefferson was a terrible speaker. Apparently had a high-pitched, squeaky voice, and couldn't put his words together very well orally, was nervous, and other people read his speeches for him. And so the interesting thing is almost everything prior to this letter that we know about Jefferson had to do with the written word. He was a very strong supporter of the written word because that was his medium. This is one of the few things he ever said about the oral word, the word delivered from the lectern by the minister to a large congregation. Of course, it's a combination because then the minister put his words in print and they were circulated widely around the country. Nobody knows what Jefferson would have said about television, the internet. We can extrapolate, we can assume what he would have said about large gatherings. At the time of the Constitution, there were laws in many states prohibiting large gatherings. And the right to assemble was seen a little bit differently than the way we sometimes think of the right of assembly. And of course, the word that Jefferson, Madison, the liberals at the time of the Constitution often used in lieu of democracy was mobocracy. Remember, they lived through the French Revolution. They were terrified of Robespierre. In fact, one of the claims that Adams ran against Jefferson in 1800 was that Jefferson was too close to the French, and Jefferson responded by saying Adams was too close to the British. So rights of assembly which could merge into riots was something the framers of the Constitution took seriously. But I think you're right. I think if you think beyond the kind, and remember, assembly is not used by rich people. That's an interesting point. That's used by poor people. Rich people don't have to assemble. They own television stations. They own newspapers. They, have access to the internet. Poor people, assembly is the poor person's free speech right. So it's a brilliant insight that you have, I think, that the first restriction on free speech would be directed against the masses, the rabble, the poor, rather than against the wealthy and the elite. Good point. Hadn't thought of that before, so thank you. I always judge the success of an appearance anywhere by what I've learned from you, and so far this has been very successful. I've learned a lot.
So we have an experiment of sorts going on right now with respect to restrictive limiting of free speech. Mm-hmm. So in post-war Germany, it is illegal to talk, in many occasions, to talk about the Holocaust from this point of view of Nazi ideology.
That's right.
Outside of educational setting.
Right.
So they made a conscious decision
mm-hmm.
To restrict their free speech in that particular corner
mm-hmm.
of the entire continuum of all the things you can talk about. So does that basically, what do you think about this? Is that not a society that has free speech in your mind? Or?
I think Germany is one of the freest societies in the world today, and I think all societies make decisions based on their history. We're all products of our experience. I wrote a book a few years ago called Rights from Wrongs, in which I argue that rights don't come from nature, they don't come from God, they don't come from mountaintops, they don't come from instruction manuals, they come from experience. And the German experience with the Weimar Republic and with the rise of Nazism and with the Holocaust led them to put restrictions on free speech. Were I a German today, I would say enough. 50 years, 60 years, it's a new generation. I would abolish any restrictions on free speech. I defended the right of Holocaust denier named Irving to speak freely in Austria and opposed his imprisonment on that ground. I oppose the Israeli government's decision to exclude Norman Finkelstein, who is not a friend of mine, who I don't support, from going to Israel and preaching his Holocaust minimization and his attacks on Holocaust survivors. I think we're a mature society today, and I would rather see a completely open debate on the Holocaust, on every other aspect of American history, of European history, of world history. I understand what the Germans did, just like I understand the Japanese after the Second World War imposed severe restrictions on arms, on weapons, on even owning large swords. They felt themselves to be too militaristic a society. And the response to that was to abolish a right which our Supreme Court has just vindicated, the right to bear arms. Whether our Supreme Court is right or wrong, I think reasonable people could disagree about. But I understand why different cultures have different rules. Now, that doesn't justify complete censorship by any culture. I don't agree that when people say, oh, you don't understand Iraq, the Iraqi people don't like democracy, or the Saudi people don't like democracy. How do we know? I mean, we've not tested it. I do think that free speech is should be always the default position, and a very, very heavy historical burden should be placed on those who would create any exceptions to free speech. And I'm proud of America for allowing radical imams to preach hate, where in Britain and Holland and France there are restrictions on it. We are a mature enough society. Now, think about, however, the marketplace of ideas argument. It doesn't necessarily hold for an imam preaching in a mosque to people who have really no access to the outside world, or a rabbi, for example, the rabbi in Israel who preached to his students that the Bible permitted the killing of former Prime Minister Rabin because he was giving land back to the Palestinians. Now, the yeshiva student who heard him and went out and killed Rabin really didn't have a marketplace of ideas. He was only hearing that one point of view. And some of the Islamic extremists are hearing only one point of view. Or a young Catholic choir boy who goes to parochial school and hears an extremist Catholic minister preach about how to block abortion clinics, might not have access to a full and complete marketplace of ideas. And so I would wonder how Jefferson whether he would modify his views in a closed marketplace or in a society that had closed marketplaces. After all, once Hitler got elected, he closed the marketplace of ideas. It didn't completely shut down, but the laws prohibited any dissenting speech. And there are still many parts of the world today where dissenting speech is not permitted. So where you have a closed marketplace, where the threats are imminent, and where you can't tolerate a first strike, a nuclear attack, or something of that kind, I ask in my book whether Jefferson would change his views, because his views seem empirically based. I wouldn't change my views because they're not empirically based. Mine are much more normatively based. I give the possibility that it might be dangerous. So the empirical changes don't affect my views as much as they do Jefferson's. If you have the simple-minded civil libertarian view, abolish torture because torture never works, then you ask yourself the question, what if torture worked? Would you change your views? Abolish the death penalty because it doesn't deter. What if it did deter? Permit free speech because it never hurts anybody. What if it did? So that's why a more nuanced, balanced view is in the end more protective of civil liberties than a completely empirically based, falsely empirically based view.
How would you apply your theories of free speech to the teaching of creationism in schools?
That's a great, great question. The role of freedom of speech in public schools that are mandatory is very, very different. I support the rights of Nazis to march through Skokie. That's a public street. I surely do not support the right of a teacher to teach Nazism to 7-year-olds in a school. I support the right of adults to watch pornography. Surely I don't support the right to teach pornography to kids in the elementary school. So I think a captive audience in a school is a very, very different situation. That's number one. Number two, religion is very different. Jefferson wrote a letter to his nephew, Peter Carr, when he turned 18. He said, "Dear Peter, now you can read the Bible. You shouldn't have read it until now because learning the Bible before the age of 18, it's just propaganda. You should start reading the Bible when you can read it critically the way you can read Thucydides and Herodotus, and read it with a critical eye. And if that critical eye leads you to believe in God, that's wonderful. And if it leads you not to believe in God, that's wonderful. And if it leads you not to believe in God, and there is a God, don't worry," he said, "about Pascal's wager." He said, don't worry about that, because if there is a God, and he's a good God, he will reward you not for the correctness of your view, but for the honesty of your search. And you should be able. So basically what the framers of the Constitution did, they made a very interesting experiment, never done before in the history of the world. They said religion does not belong as part of the civic dialogue. It's in churches, synagogues, and mosques. That's where religion stays. The school should be, yes, secular, not religious. Yes, that takes a point of view. You can go from school to church. You can go to Sunday school. You can go to Saturday school. You can go every night of the week to school. You can even, according to the Supreme Court, be homeschooled or go to religious school. But you can't expect the public schools to take a position on religion. Now, the opponents of evolution say evolution is a religious point of view. Or what they say is creationism is equally scientific with religion. Well, let it compete in the marketplace of ideas. And if it achieves a degree of acceptance in science, then it belongs in the schools. But not as a balance, not as a religious balance against a secular approach. I mean, should there also be a religious approach to mathematics, a religious approach to a variety of other subjects, to geography? So I think the creationist claim to have some access to the mind of the student in the school is much stronger than most other religious claims. because of the civil liberties First Amendment issue. But on the end, I don't think it deserves support. My dear friend, my teaching colleague, Stephen Jay Gould, testified in the famous case in which the Supreme Court did hold that creationism could not be taught in the school, that it was religious dogma. Would that case come out today the same way? I don't know. Here, I don't want to get political. But would it come out here and being descriptive? Please. I hope I can be descriptive. But if McCain is elected president, he has told us he will appoint to the Supreme Court people like Justices Alito, Scalia, and Thomas. And those are three justices who want to bring down the wall of separation. And the Supreme Court might come out quite differently on a creationism case if the Supreme Court had a different membership. I'm not positive. I'm not sure. But it certainly is something to be concerned about, I believe.
I wanted to get a little bit more of your opinion on the health of the marketplace of ideas in this country.
Yeah.
You spoke in terms of every good question having a duck with a foot on each side of the line.
Right.
And yet when you look at all of the political coverage of late, it seems like there's often the criticism that political candidates are being too nuanced in their description and they're losing voters. And when one debate answer is too detailed, it's saying, oh, well, it doesn't appeal to the
right.
the viscera. And so I wonder whether you think that's being lost. And
I do. I mean, if you read the, when Adams ran against Jefferson again, neither of them campaigned. It was regarded as undignified to want the presidency. They all campaigned behind the scenes, but they didn't campaign openly. But they wrote essays, and they had all their letters and correspondence, and the debate was much more nuanced than it is today. I think the American public sometimes doesn't know the difference between electing President of the United States and voting for the American Idol. There is a sense of we don't want people who are better than we are. Of course we do. The President of the United States should be very smart and very experienced and better than most people. Yes, we believe in meritocracy, but that doesn't mean that even though all people are created equal, all people have equal ability to lead as president. So I do think that we're seeing a dumbing down of a lot of the debates. What worries me more is what I see going on some colleges and university campuses, where a sense of political correctness has dominated some of the discussion. Look, I'm a liberal, so most of the political correctness is on my side. I still don't like it. I still don't like when a student feels some way intimidated by an ability to express contrarian views in the classroom. And I would like to make sure we have structural protections of students so that the widest variety of viewpoints can be openly expressed without fear of consequences, except the consequences that flow from the marketplace of ideas. That doesn't mean that we should have full and complete free speech in even a university classroom. I have a right on a street corner to call a person by a racial epithet. That's my protected free speech right. But as a professor, I have no right to call my student by a racial epithet or by a gender epithet or by a sexual orientation. I have no right to insult my students in that way. I have a right to insult my students if their arguments are, really foolish. I try my best not to do that. But there are certain limitations on when I've taken the job as professor, I give up some of my rights. Larry Summers learned that lesson very carefully when you become the president of a university. Larry would not have lost his job had he been a student making those views, probably not as a professor, maybe not even as a chairman of the department, but as a president of a university. When you say something which is perceived as deeply insulting to half of your students, I was invited a few years ago to speak at the University Club, or the Australia Club in Sydney, Australia, on behalf of Harvard. The Harvard Association was having its meetings there. And I discovered that the Australia Club at that point in time didn't allow women in, didn't allow blacks in, didn't allow Jews in, and had some trouble with Catholics. And I said, I can't go and speak there. And they said, well, you're denying us our right of assembly. I said, no, I'm not. I'm just not going to speak at a club which discriminates against or more than half of the student body of Harvard. And you have to change your rules. And we moved the event to a different place. So we all have some restrictions on our free speech. And speech is a matter of time, manner, location. I'm allowed to speak, but at 11 o'clock at night, I can't take a sound truck to your house and boom loud noises into your bedroom. It's not a question of what the content is. It's a question of the manner in which I'm expressing myself. Yeah, follow up.
I guess my question was, if Jefferson is predicating his argument in defense of free speech on the vibrancy of the market of ideas, what does the dumbing down of that market imply for his argument for free speech?
Here's the problem. You're absolutely right. It diminishes the impact of the market. What's the alternative? The alternative is we can't have governmental regulation, whatever the opposite of dumbing down, smartening up, is we really have to let the market determine that. And it's very hard because we have a Gresham's law of politics, and the cheaper and nastier you get, the more you prevail. I've heard so many friends of mine who support one particular candidate or the other saying, I hope the other side stops its miserable, dirty, lying attacks, and I hope my candidate fights back with, equal fervor. So, we all want to see the other side be clean and our side respond. I think everybody in this room would love to see, a Lincoln-Douglas debate every day. But we're not going to see Lincoln-Douglas debates, I don't think, anymore in our society, because today Abraham Lincoln would not be elected president. Thomas Jefferson couldn't get elected dog catcher today. His ideas are so complicated and so nuanced that most of the great political figures in American history couldn't be elected. They're not soundbite politicians, and we pay a price for that. Yep. Yeah.
So let's talk both kiddie porn and terrorism.
Okay. Wow.
So here at Google, we have to be very careful when it comes to kiddie porn, right? Because for us...
Yes, you definitely should be. As a lawyer, let me tell you, be very careful.
Kiddie porn to an end user turns them into a felon, right?
And let me tell you another thing. Kiddie porn is too easily available today on the internet. I've had 4 or 5 former students call me, tears in their eyes, saying they were sitting around, it was late at night, they had nothing to do, they went to this website, then they went to that website, and before they knew it, they were on a kiddie porn website. Now they realize it was a governmentally sponsored kiddie porn website, Operation Lollipop, and now they're on a computer list by the government, and do they have to tell their wives? Do they have to tell their employers? Are they in deep trouble? I said, why'd you do it? It was so easy. In the old days, you had to go with a raincoat and your hat to a miserable part of town. You had to look to make sure nobody was around, and you had to pay the money, and you couldn't get kiddie porn anyway. You just got adult porn. Today, kiddie porn. It's so easy.
Right. So what surprises me there is that you said Harvard law students cry, but
they're all former law students, and they only cry about themselves.
So I want to contrast 2 situations, right? So if we find kiddie porn, we let the FBI know about it, right? Okay. Now let's think about terrorism.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we can't, let the FBI or let the government know when we find an image of terrorism or when there is an article espousing terrorism, because it's an inchoate idea, right? You can look at an image and say, yeah, that might be kiddie porn. You can't look at an image and say, yeah, that might be terrorism. But let's imagine a world in which that were the case, right? I'm sure you wouldn't, there can be no doubt that if that were the case, there would be a law passed requiring us to let the government know.
Yes.
My question to you is, how do we figure out whether a law like that is good or not? Because it seems to require us to make a compromise between many different things, such as the right to privacy, such as the danger to humanity, and so on.
First of all, life's full of compromises, and I don't have to tell
you're
you.
a lawyer. You're supposed to figure them out. Right?
Google has compromised, obviously. We know about some of the compromises that all of the internet providers and all of the high-tech companies have had to make over time to do business in some parts of the world, et cetera. So the question is the nature of the compromise. My brother-in-law is a high-tech guy, and he's developed a technology for helping the Defense Department filter words and try to get patterns of words that are going through the ether, essentially, that indicate potential terrorist plots. As you know, you can easily today identify phrases, but what my brother-in-law added to the science is he was able to do it with concepts, not just phrases. He was able to take unrelated words and put them together and get phrases. And part of the answer is going to be, how good's the science? How many false positives? How many false negatives? What is the ratio? If we have to intrude on thousands of conversations to get one potential threat, the answer will be different. If we only have to intrude on dozens of conversations and all of those conversations are of a questionable nature anyway, the balance will be struck very differently. The essence is to identify these issues early on, to subject them to a lot of scrutiny, a lot of debate, a lot of both in-house and then public comment. Let the science be known to the extent it can be known so that the rest of us can then have our input. And in the end, one hopes that democracy will come to some of the right answers. Now, we have a balance between democracy and elitism. The Supreme Court's not a democratic institution. The Bill of Rights is counter-majoritarian, counter-democratic, and it has certain provisions that are supposed to be binding. And that weighs in the balance. But you can be sure that the Supreme Court will 9-0, any Supreme Court will allow an intrusion if the intrusion is very, very accurate and very, very likely, with minimal invasion of privacy, to prevent maximal damage to a society. All of it will depend. You know, there's a great story in the Bible. It's my favorite story in the Bible. It's about Abraham, the first lawyer in the Bible, and he is arguing with God. He meets God in like chapter 6, and by chapter 7 he's arguing with him because God says to him, I'm going to kill all the sinners of Sodom. And Abraham says to God, how dare you? I mean, he really speaks to him very roughly. The Hebrew is Khalilah, which the King James Version interprets as far be it from thee, but the actual word is it would be profane, sacrilegious of you, God, to sweep away the innocent along with the guilty. What if there are 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom? And God says, well, all right, Abraham, you're right. If there are 50 righteous people, I won't kill the city. So Abraham, the good lawyer, says, 50. What if there are only 40? For the lack of 10, would you kill? And God said, no, you're right, I won't for 40. And Abraham says, what about 30? God says, all right, what about 20? And then he says, what about 10? And then after 10, God agrees, and the Bible says, and then Abraham walked back to his place. He didn't say 8, 7, 6, 5. He stopped at 10. The first time morality in history has ever been a matter of numbers and a matter of degree. It may not always be wrong to do great amount of justice, even if there's some little bit of injustice. We don't stop imprisoning people just because out of thousands and thousands of people, 10 innocent people might be in prison. But we might stop executing people if, as they found on Illinois death row, there were 13 innocent people. As we speak today, they're about to execute a man who the Supreme Court is going to decide next Monday whether to review his case, but they're going to execute him today, even though of the 12 witnesses who testified against him, 7 have now recanted their testimony. Now, you know, Abraham would have an easy time arguing against that. But the question is always going to be a matter of numbers and a matter of degree. Is it appropriate to bomb a terrorist headquarters from which rockets are coming if you know that you'll kill 30 terrorists and perhaps 1 civilian? Very different than if you're going to kill 1 terrorist and 30 civilians. The rules of proportionality go back to St. Thomas Aquinas. They obviously go back to this story in the Bible. And every moral system has to try to strike these very, very difficult balances.
Actually, I want to try and get 1 or 2 remote questions in here first.
Great.
And the question that we had from Santa Monica is actually sort of on the topic of campaigns. Sort of, is the McCain-Feingold campaign finance reform restriction of free speech?
Well, as you know, there's a great debate about whether or not campaign restrictions violate free speech, and the answer is yes, they do, but they also promote free speech at the same time. They restrict the free speech of the wealthy, and maybe they help level the playing field. These are very, very difficult balances, and the Supreme Court, not surprisingly, has upheld some of these laws in closely divided votes. Senator Feingold was my former student. I'm very proud of him, and I like the politics behind campaign reform, but as a free speech activist, I get a little nervous about imposing restrictions. After all, what are campaign contributions? They're another manifestation of speech. If, to take your point from before, if mobs and crowds are a poor man's way of speaking, campaign contributions are the rich woman's way of speaking. We all know rich people who have much more political influence than we do. They don't vote more than once, But boy, they have a lot more political influence because they are chairman of bundlers and this and that, and they get access, and they have enormous political influence. So yeah, it's going to be a compromise on full and complete freedom of expression to impose restrictions on campaign finance contributions, but it's probably a good thing to do.
I just want to get one more in here, which is there anything you believe would not be appropriate for a defense lawyer to do in the name of giving a client the best possible defense?
Sure, anything.
Anything which does not itself violate any laws. For example, using statistics in intentionally misleading ways.
I think it would be wrong to use statistics in an intentionally misleading way, and I know what your questioner has in mind because I've been accused of that. Here's the accusation to show you how the accusation is false. This involved the argument that was made in the O.J. Simpson case that because he beat his wife, it follows that he probably killed her because the argument was made that when a person beats his wife, there's a statistical correlation to killing the wife. So we were very critical of that. And then they came back and they said, no, you're wrong about that. The relevant statistic is how many people who beat their wife and whose wives eventually end up being murdered are the ones who killed. And that's, of course, a very important point, obviously a much, much higher percentage. But that's the misleading statistic. Let me explain to you why. Yes, a high percentage of men who beat their wives and then their wife ends up being murdered, in fact, kill their wives. But a very high percentage of men who didn't beat their wives, whose wives end up being murdered, are also guilty. That is, the vast majority of wives who are murdered by their husbands, whether they ever beat them or not. And so the question statistically is the salience of the beating. And that will, of course, depend on how severe the beating was, how repeated the beating was. The statistics seem to demonstrate that an occasional act of violence between a man and a woman has very little, if any, salience in predicting or even post-dicting based on somebody who's been dead. So that's just the answer to that statistical question. The Times published this a couple of months ago. I wrote a letter in response explaining, but they didn't publish my point. So the argument is out there, but my response in the marketplace of ideas is not out there. So I'm glad to have an opportunity to put it out there. The other issue, though, is a very, very important one. What would a criminal defense lawyer do? Of course, I would never do anything illegal. Even if I thought my client was innocent, I wouldn't give him a key to break out of prison. I had 2 young boys on death row a few years ago who were innocent, and I saved their lives ultimately, but I had horrible, horrible nightmares about what if I couldn't save their lives. Another man saw the perpetrator and eyeballed him and said, that's him, that's him. My son discovered that the 2 men were homosexual lovers. It was a gay bar, and the person who was the witness was his lover. And normally, when there's a witness, you can ask, are you married to the person? Are you in a romantic relationship with the person? Because that might affect their credibility. But my son didn't want to do that because he saw the jury, this was many years ago, and he saw it was potentially a homophobic jury. And he realized that if they learned that the victim was gay and that the eyewitness was gay, they might be biased against them. And my son didn't want to partake in any kind of bigotry of that kind. And he called the supervisor and said, I'm just not going to raise the issue. And the supervisor said, you must do it. It's relevant. It may not be highly relevant, but it's relevant. You're the defense attorney. You're not a member of Gay and Lesbians United for Justice. You're a member of the defense bar. You have to be like that horse who has the things on the side that don't let him look to the right or the left. You have to look just straight ahead. And my son did it, and he won the case, and he shortly thereafter quit the legal aid agency. He couldn't do it. He couldn't bear to use sexism, homophobia, racism to win a case. Or what do you do if you have a witness who says they saw your client rob the bank, and you know that the witness saw your client rob the bank because your client told you that he robbed the bank in confidence, but the witness wasn't wearing her glasses? And are you allowed to question her, were you wearing your glasses? How was your vision without glasses? In order to convey the impression to a jury, an impression you know to be false, that she might not have seen clearly enough, even though it's true that she wasn't wearing her glasses. These are very, very, very hard questions. Or what if a client says to you, I need the name of the witness against me? And you know the name of the witness, and you're going to cross-examine the witness, but you know that the client wants the name of the witness for improper purposes. Would you give the client the name of the witness and then hold yourself responsible if something bad happened to the witness? These are the hardest questions that criminal defense lawyers face all the time. On Thursday, I teach my class on Legal Ethics and Tactics, where we raise all of these complex and difficult issues. And it's primarily the responsibility of the bar to pass rules. For example, when I started practicing law, we were allowed to question a rape victim about her prior sexual history. I was very much opposed to that, and I was very active in trying to get rape shield laws passed that would not permit lawyers to ask that question, because I didn't regard the question as relevant, and I thought it was highly prejudicial, and I thought it discouraged many rape victims from going forward. And for that reason, I didn't take rape cases, because I didn't want to be in the position of A, using that kind of an argument, but I also didn't want to be in a position of depriving my client of the right to have an argument that was available used. So the best thing is they changed the law. And that's why it's generally the responsibility of society at large, not the responsibility of the criminal defense lawyer, to make those changes which strike the appropriate balance again. I come back to where I started, the appropriate balance. That's so hard to do in a society, in a world that's so complicated. When we have a rape shield law, sometimes it keeps out relevant information. But on balance, that's better than the prior world in which we lived. If we didn't have it, that might help some innocent people get acquitted, but it at a cost too great for us to experience. And so these are all balanced judgments that have to get struck. And you know, I hope that in all the work you do, we do, political, legal, scientific, that understanding how to strike that important balance remains the essence of what distinguishes a civilized society from a society which sees things in the simplest black and white terms.
On that note, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. I've learned a lot.